Hello and welcome to this in-depth special edition of Israel Update. And my guest today is the founder and president of an NGO called NGO Monitor. He's also Professor Emeritus of Political Science from Bar-Ilan University in Israel, and his name is Gerald Steinberg. Gerald, shalom.
Shalom, Gadi.
So tell us, first of all, what NGO Monitor does.
The name is somewhat expressive of the goal. We watch NGOs, non-governmental organizations, as political actors. I have a background, as you said, in politics, international relations. 20 years ago, 25 years ago, I began to understand that NGOs, non-governmental organizations, groups like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Oxfam, there's an infinite number. I didn't realize how many when I started this research. They have a lot of power in setting agendas, and we'll probably talk about that in terms of the context of the post-October 7th slaughter, massacre, whatever term we use, and the way in which these organizations are shaping the media coverage, the political statements, a lot of the aspects. But this was true 20, 25 years ago as well. It wasn't as blatant necessarily. So there is, unlike very many other, and I call this an industry, many other areas of in commerce and in all sorts of politics where there are checks and balances in open societies, in terms of powerful groups like this, there are no real checks and balances. There are no monitors, there are no watchdogs. The United Nations, there is something called UN Watch, Elchanan Gorner, and other groups that monitor and report on the United Nations and its violations of its own mission statement, its own charter. There are other organizations that monitor the media, that monitor academics, but nobody was monitoring and writing about and researching the differences between the way in which NGOs presented themselves, the supporters of human rights, the great moral principled organizations that have no connection with governments, and the reality, which is very much they have become mouthpieces and echo chambers for many of those forces, including for terrorist groups like Hamas. So the research there, what do they say, what is the reality, and what are the internal contradictions is very much part of our work.
The conservative Swedish journalist Paulina Neuding once said that Israel is a Disneyland for NGOs. Tell us a little bit about that, because it seems that like every NGO under the sun is trying to meddle in Israeli affairs.
Yeah, part of this is the ideology that you and others write about, and that is that NGOs are a great place. They're really a very inviting location for post-colonialism or decolonizing, for that agenda which divides the world in intersectionality. It goes to different neo-Marxism. There are lots of terms that can be used, but basically it's the political philosophy and the agenda which divides the world in half between the good victims of colonialism, of Westernism, of capitalism, of Zionism. In a minute I'll talk about how Israel fits right into that puzzle. And the other half of the world, which are the oppressors, the aggressors, and that's the West, that's the United States particularly. And Israel, for all sorts of reasons, a combination of reasons, is the easiest target to go after. Go after the United States, that's fine, but nobody really cares. It does have a progressive following in the United States, attacks the United States policies, but doesn't really change those policies very much in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other places. The United States looks after its own interests without having too much attention to that type of ideology. Israel's a much easier, much bigger, juicier target to hit. And then you add to that a layer of anti-Semitism, a strong layer of anti-Semitism. Very often you'll have both Christian and Muslim organizations which will join in that ideology and use it to their advantage. So you have on university campuses, you have intersectionality, which is that Palestinians are not only additional victims, but today they are the dominant victim, along with blacks and Black Lives Matter and other minority groups who are oppressed. That adds to the decolonization language. So Israel is very much a target, has been, again, for at least 20, 25 years. When I first began to observe it, but much more amplified, much more powerful than it was. It's such an easy target to go after. Those Jews are just terrible what they're doing to those poor people who are suffering in Gaza. And if some Jews were killed or kidnapped, well, they deserved it. That's really the philosophy that we're seeing from these organizations and through that prism.
How influential are they?
I think they're extremely influential in the media. Let's start with that. If you look at all of the different mainstream media, classic media platforms, BBC, New York Times, CNN, not only are they quoted, but they appear on the television and radio platforms. Some people still use those. They are very dominant expert voices. So you see Omar Shakir, Sari Bashi from Human Rights Watch, Agnes Calamard, and others from Amnesty International. Ken Roth from the ex-Human Rights Watch now has some sort of bogus academic title that he uses. But that's from the same framework. It's all very much this NGO network that becomes very influential, quoted in New York Times, very often in The Guardian, and then, of course, there's social media where they're active 24/7. So they become, I'd say, dominant voices, very strong voices in setting the agenda. Then it goes beyond that, because once they set the agenda of the suffering of the Palestinians, and you have the pictures in the background which are used to match that, then you have politicians, diplomats. You have Macron in France said we have to have a ceasefire now in the UN Security Council, and you have Kamala Harris from the United States Vice President. Occasionally you hear echoes of that, more than echoes perhaps from the Secretary of State Blinken and from President Biden as well. So this is very much the echo of that whole process. Now, if there were no NGOs and you just had the pictures of the fighting in Gaza and you had the UN agencies, which is a different part of the network, then you would still have some of that pushback. But I argue that it would not nearly be as strong as the fact that you have all these NGOs that are known as the dominant, these are the experts, these are the world's arbiters of morality in the realm of human rights and international law. They play a major role in that process.
It seems that if you just put the magic words human rights in your title or mission description, then automatically you gain moral sanctity and are allowed to pass judgment on whoever you want. But the very term human rights is twisted in a horrible way, because some of these organizations do the exact opposite. The idea of human rights means that all human beings have a set of rights that are unalienable, while what they are doing is applying a double standard, and also, it turns out, taking money from very unscrupulous people, including, we saw in a documentary, I'm sure you're familiar with it, another organization in Israel did it, Adkan. They are great. I should translate that as enough, right?
Yeah,
Adkan is enough, and they put a Scandinavian agent, a young woman who posed as a human rights activist, and she penetrated ISM, the International Solidarity Movement, and she found out that these people are taking money from Hamas in Gaza. It's just, this is a front for a terror organization, for a terrorist organization. So, would you say that this is a unique thing? ISM is unique in this, or are other human rights organizations actually affiliated with the worst violators of human rights?
I call the NGO human rights network an industry. And NGO Monitor tracks 250 organizations. So what Atkan did with ISM was good in the sense that they penetrated and they got the evidence on camera. But now we have something else. Look, Human Rights Watch, which is my pet peeve, okay? I think that Ken Roth and Human Rights Watch over the last 25 years has done more destruction to the moral principles, the universal principles, as you pointed out, of human rights, the ones that were created in the shadow of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, under what's called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We're coming up to the, I guess, the 76th anniversary, because it was in 1948, and another, actually this month in a few days.
Yeah.
And they've twisted it completely and used it, they've weaponized it against Israel, but it's an industry, and I want to get back to the money. ISM is important, but Human Rights Watch has got 100 million a year plus a $250 million endowment or slush fund. And if you haven't followed the news in the last few days, a different organization called MEMORY, Middle East Media Research
Institute
Organization, has published a letter, a leaked letter going back to 2018, which certifies that the Qatar government, this is almost like Hamas. We can discuss the nuances of the differences, but the Qatar government said an additional 3 million euros goes to Human Rights Watch in 2018. Additional, there was probably money before. And so why don't we know about this? Human Rights Watch is a United States government registered charity. Under the Internal Revenue Service, they produce documents every year with their funding. They don't have to publish who their donors are. Now, in 2009, they did, and then they suddenly stopped because we found out, because of a newspaper article in Saudi Arabia that one of our researchers happened to notice as part of our work, that Sarah Leah Whitston was sent by Ken Roth to go raise money in Saudi Arabia. She also went to Libya, where she pronounced Gaddafi a human rights reformer. These things, it's in Hebrew we have the term hazui. These are insane for an organization, absurd, that says that it's the world's most important, most expert, most moral human rights supporter. This was 14 years ago. So
there was something in the deal. There was something in the deal, some secret annex to their contract, if I'm not mistaken, with Saudi Arabia, that says that it would not be that they would not criticize Saudi Arabia on what?
Well, first of all, this was a donation that was made around 2011, 2012 of $470,000, not the 3 million of Qatar. This is some Saudi corrupt billionaire that Human Rights Watch had even written a report on for abusing his workers, which raises the question of whether this was a blackmail. And it was kept secret till 2020. And one of the annexes of this agreement has came out in 2020 in a progressive publication called The Intercept, which was leaked, that the email was leaked, said that part of the deal was they would not just on Saudi Arabia, they would not use the money to promote the equality of LGBT people, of gays, the range. That was signed off on by Ken Roth himself and Human Rights. And his board then, which is really his own structure. Again, there are no checks and balances. They have this fictitious board, which reports to the U.S. government and says, "Oh, this is all kosher, it's all good." And they said, "Well, we had a discussion and we resolved the issues." So, how much more is in this? How many other skeletons are in this closet of this supposedly very moral, principled guardian of world human rights, which just so happens places huge percentage of its emphasis, disproportionality, a term that Ken Roth loves to use about Israel and Gaza.
Yeah.
Disproportionality in Human Rights Watch's focusing on Israel and weaponization against Israel.
How many of these human rights organizations publish lies, provable lies, blood libels about the IDF soldiers in Israel? I mean, I don't mean to get a number. I mean, just to get some examples of how they do this.
There's a range, and I'm an academic, and I want to be careful about the language that I use. So a lie is they say that somebody was killed. Saying that Israel deliberately kills Palestinians and Palestinian children, we categorize that as a lie, although the term deliberately is obviously not something that anybody can prove. There are, I would say, at least 150 organizations, at least. There are Palestinian groups that are affiliated with the Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine. There are a human rights network run by a terrorist organization. Why? Because the Europeans love it. They eat it up. Al-Haq, Shawan Jabarin, who sat in Israeli jail for recruiting and training terrorists, set up this organization and this whole network called, he set up Al-Haq, which is the law, which is in Europe. You go to a meeting of the UN Human Rights Council, you go to a parliament in Western Europe, and you see Shawan Jabarin was there 2 weeks ago, the noted human rights expert from the highly respected organization Al-Haq. So there are a good 20 or 30 Palestinian groups like that. There are Israeli
that
groups
are directly funded by some form of other or a terrorist umbrella organization.
Do I say it again?
That are directly affiliated with.
No. I'm saying those the lie. I'm going
organization.
back to the question about lies. There are about, I think, 13. I think we've identified Palestinian groups that, under different human rights and some humanitarian aid titles, that are in that PFLP network. But the network, everybody quotes them. You pick up a Human Rights Watch report and you'll see Al-Haq quoted, or the Defense for Children International Palestine, or Adamir, which is as the New York Times quoted it, the Palestinian Prisoners Defense Organization. They're all part of the PFLP structure, and their prisoners are terrorists who've been convicted in Israeli jails. So, but then you have all the other groups that quote each other. So you have B'Tselem and Breaking the Silence, and the other Israeli Yesh, and again, they're all themes and variations. Israeli groups that submit documents, letters to the United Nations on Israeli war crimes. And they all quote each other and work together in that. And then you have the broader group of these big international groups like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty. So it really is a very strong, powerful industry. And the money there is extremely important now. It's at least in the industry at large, we're talking about billions of dollars. On Israel, probably 250 million US dollars a year through this whole NGO network. That's a lot of money, and they buy a lot of PR. So they get their, I was going to say reports, but I think it's got to be a better term than that, into the New York Times as headline stories. Israel's an apartheid state, says noted human rights experts from Human Rights Watch. That's how the industry works. And I'll just add another sentence, which is the Israeli government has not been successful in any way in dealing with this, which we can talk about.
It has been negligent, not just unsuccessful. You're very polite, but I'll be less polite. Israel has woken up to the damages of this industry very, very late, and is not doing enough. So we have you. There's also a monitor of the Palestinian media, a watchdog. There's and there are a handful of other, I'd say, pro-Israeli NGOs that deal with anything from immigration to human rights in general, and war, and the occupation.
Textbooks, education.
Sorry?
Textbooks, education,
yeah,
incitements. We don't do that. They do that.
You specialize on tracing the money. How do you do that?
First of all, because I keep coming back to this term industry and the amount of money. Without the money, they wouldn't be able. Nobody would care. They wouldn't be able to press their agendas, their campaigns. These are expensive. Huge part of all these organizations is their PR and communications divisions. So you have a large number of people whose entire lives are focused on getting their reports out there, whether it's in the media, whether it's to parliaments, whether it's in the UN, all these other different places. Now, where does that money come from? Because if you turn off the money, then you turn off or at least you certainly lower the volume of the organization. And that became a very important issue. I'll just add that when I started to look at this, and I had some back and forth emails with Ken Roth, Human Rights Watch, and some of the other people. Apart from the fact they were condescending and trivial in their responses, it was clear that the ideology was just, they weren't interested in any kind of dialogue. They had power, and they didn't need to explain or to defend in any other way. So I'm not going to convince them that what they're doing is wrong, whatever that may mean in terms of morality or politically or whatever, or inconsistent with the values. So the next line of defense is to go to the funders, the donors. And that was also quite surprising, that a large part of this network is actually funded by governments. These are non-governmental organizations. But if you look at the Palestinian and the Israeli groups and a lot of the European groups, and to some degree, but not so much the United States, you see that they are funded by governments, by the UN sometimes. But the European governments, they're best friends, they're experts on Palestinian issues, on Israeli-Palestinian issues, are the NGOs. And they're close allies. I call them subcontractors in the research and academic publications. So we're talking about 100 million euros a year just to those organizations that do Israeli-Palestinian human rights and related issues in quotes that gets funded by European governments. That's beginning to change slowly because for years they've said, no, the research that shows that Shaman Jabarin from Al-Haq is affiliated with the PFLP and all these other groups, that's not real information. That's not real evidence.
Just to make clear to our listeners, you're talking about the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine.
Right,
that's who they're affiliated with. It's the terror organization.
And as a terrorist organization, they are recognized as such not only by Israel, by the United States, by European Union, by other countries, but giving the organizations that have people affiliated with them, that's okay because the Europeans kept saying to us, but there's no proof the money goes to terror. It was European ambassadors and diplomats and all sorts of other members of parliament responded, we don't want to talk about it, is basically what they said. But now there is beginning, I think this is one perhaps beginning of a response after October 7th. The Swiss,
so there's a noticeable difference after October 7th in the way people are listening to you guys?
The Germans in particular. The Germans are one of the worst in the funding area.
Which is amazing. It's amazing how, and I won't go into this now, I'll just give you the headlines, because as far as I understand, I don't speak German, but this is their perverse play with their own guilt. They have a vested interest in showing that we are the Nazis. So it's not them anymore. Now it's us. And one step away from this, they don't actually do it, but it's like in the background is that it's a new vehicle for their anti-Semitism, which said, you see, they are the Nazis. So it's good we at least tried, isn't it? Something
Israel,
like that.
Israelis are as bad as the Nazis, and there's no
then why not kill them
against us? But that goes in deeper, and that's also part of it. But it's also a lack of oversight. The parliament, members of parliament, have no idea where the money goes to the NGOs. We're the only ones who found it because we looked at it systematically. All the information we have is open source. You just have to know how to look at it and dig down deep. I won't go through all the details. Germany, the EU, and Switzerland have each, in the last 2 months, frozen significant funding for their NGO subcontractors, for the Palestinian NGO subcontractors. The Israeli groups are still getting money.
In response to your complaints, Joe?
In response to the research that we've done and submitted, and then members of parliament, and in some cases journalists, have raised those issues to a visible enough area that they are a level that they can't avoid it anymore. So we are now reading, at this moment, 2 reports that just came out. One from the EU and one from the Swiss government, their Swiss International Development Agency, which is so closely tied with this network. There's a spiderweb picture of me on one of the covers of their magazines because I had the chutzpah, the terrible right-wing, whatever, all the language that they use of raising questions and exposing this. But now the governments are taking some action. So we do see a reduction. I'd say maybe 10% right now, but it starts a process of, for the first time in 20 years, investigating, taking it seriously. Who are we funding? The United States is different. In the United States, Congress has hearings every year. We catch them every once in a while on making a mistake, but they're pretty good about not having funding going to terrorist fronts under the label of human rights or under the label of international aid or international law. The Europeans almost never have any kind of public discussion, so members of parliament don't know, and the foreign ministers, I think in many cases, simply rubber stamp the allocations. And they'll say, well, we have a $100 million, 150 EU, $150 million budget or euro budget for NGOs worldwide. You can't expect that the minister will go over all the details. And so the question there, well, why isn't there some sort of bureau in your government, in your European External Action Service
that tracks the money?
Right, you just, everybody signs up, but the same, one of the pieces of research that I did and published was that they always say that they do annual call for proposals. And it just so happens that exactly the same organizations every year get their money, whether it's Al-Haq and Defense for Children International Palestine, or whether it's B'Tselem and Breaking the Silence in Yesh Din. And now that argument that maybe the process is inherently corrupt, or at least does not have any of the requirements of due diligence, needs to be examined. And that's what the Europeans, the Swiss, and the Germans have started to do. And they have frozen significant funds, and that's important.
But you've had successes long before this October 7 massacre, and the way it partly worked. I'm an admirer of your work, and I've been following it diligently for years. Is the way it works is you prepare a report on where the money is going, and then that report can serve to embarrass governments and donors in European countries and elsewhere, in the West especially, where the press can criticize the government. So part of the way you work is just providing the research for others to then make use of. Do you also submit it to the government of Israel, and do its diplomats do some of this work?
Our reports are all public. We put them out on our website. We make them available. We do push them to the relevant stakeholders. So if we do a report on Switzerland, and you're right, we've had various successes in the past, but usually one-offs, not systematic across examining all the NGOs that they're funding. And that's a difference. But we've had successes precisely because of the research that we're doing, because nobody's ever done it before, and then getting it out there and getting it discussed. I'll give you an example, and then I'll get to the Israeli government in a minute. I'll give you an example, and then I'll get to the Israeli government aspect of this. The example is that in 2019, there was a terror attack in which a 17-year-old Israeli girl by the name of Rina Schneer was killed, and her father and brother were wounded. And when the Israeli security forces arrested a number of Palestinians, it turned out that at least 5 of those who were arrested and indicted, and I believe some of them have been convicted or are standing trial, they are officials, top officials of an organization called the Union of Agricultural Workers Committees, UAWC. A very obscure sounding type of name. Not human rights, but part of the PFLP network that got huge amount of money, 30+ million euros from the Dutch government to help the Palestinian economy. People, the finance officers and heads of the organization were not just arrested and convicted, but they even boasted about their role, this great operation which killed a 17-year-old Israeli girl. There, the Dutch parliament forced the government, and it's important for me to say that at the time, the minister in charge of development aid is married to, she's no longer the minister, but she was at the time, and she is married to a close confidant of Yasser Arafat's ambassador, a diplomat, a Palestinian diplomat. She was in charge of development aid in Holland, and she's still considered to be a candidate for a high-level European position now that she's out of the Dutch government. All the changes that have happened there. But my point is that UAWC, the Dutch government, was forced to have an independent investigation, and what a shock. They hired they contracted to a legitimate research firm that happened to find exactly the same outcome as what NGO Monitor found, because it's all open and available, and they cut the funding. So each one of these successes, they didn't bother to look at all the other groups that they funded. It was only a one-off, but it would set the tone for later on. The Israeli government, when we wrote our report, we of course sent it both to the Israeli Foreign Ministry officials to deal with Europe, also to the ambassador, the embassy in The Hague, and in each of the countries that we work, we will send reports to the ambassadors in each of those countries, including in Washington, and it's up to them to decide whether, and the foreign ministry to decide whether they consider the information serious enough to be able to act on it. And there's sometimes Sometimes they do. They use the material quite well, and others are hesitant. They don't want to interfere with the decisions about funding civil society. There's a very strange ruling by I think the Foreign Ministry's legal advisor of a few years ago that said that the Israeli government officials could not express themselves on European funding to Israeli NGOs. So a European government can give a lot of money to Breaking the Silence and all those other groups, the HD and to B'Tselem, and again, it's a network of about 20 organizations, but which never happens in any other democratic country. You can imagine if the Irish government funded a Canadian environmental group that was protesting a gas pipeline that was being built in Alberta. Actually, there is a precedent of that. The Canadian government threw them out. It wasn't Irish, but it was a European funded group. They threw them out on their ears. America would do it instantly. But in the Israeli government, in the fiction that we live in, the legal advisor said, no, you can't even discuss or raise the issue of funding to an Israeli registered NGO that's provided by a European government, as if 90% of their funding, or some of these groups get 70 or 90% of their funding from European governments, that is not supposed to be a international political issue. There's an absurdity there, which at some point, given our agenda, we will try.
Unsurprising, though. Unsurprising, because we know who are Israel's progressive elites are entrenched in the government bureaucracy, and especially as legal advisors.
You're not surprised. You've seen this in so many other.
Yeah, the court, the Israeli court actually has an executive arm. They have their legal advisors inside the ministries are basically the bosses of the ministers who tell the ministers what they can and cannot do.
We're not just based on law. We're freezing this discussion until after the war, but this particular case just it illustrates the power that is exerted by the NGO lobby, both in terms of perceptions and definitions. We are civil society. We are above politics. That's the slogan or the myth that is so widely accepted in part of this structure. And the Europeans, that's part of the European dogma as well. So they hear it from all the European counterparts.
Yeah.
And NGOs are not touchable, untouchable.
Let's end with one of my favorite topics, the New Israel Fund. Tell our American viewers who don't, I'm guessing that among our viewers, whoever is a liberal Jew would know, but the others may not. So what is the New Israel Fund?
I'll give you my own interpretation. It's a book that needs to be written. It's an alternative government. NIF, the New Israel Fund, was founded after the 1977 Israeli elections, in which for the first time, the labor coalition, Mapai and its friends, were removed from office and replaced by this terrible right-wing peacemonger named Menachem Begin.
Whose picture is right above your head in our frame.
Yes, it is.
Small picture of Menachem Begin.
About him and the Egyptian negotiations and how they got to a peace treaty. The NIF was founded by Israelis and their friends in the United States, and that we would call now on the Democratic Progressive Left, as an alternative government to maintain the structure and the funding while they were out of office. They had presumed for a year or two, and then they would come roaring back. And the way to do that was through funding of NGOs. This was a new concept. It was popular in the United States, and then it spread to Israel, and this was a major vehicle for doing that. So over the years, we're talking now about a total of about 50 years almost, and 40 years plus, they have funded hundreds of organizations. Their annual budget now, I believe, is close to $30 million. That may decline for both domestic and external reasons. But they're also, to a certain degree, they're a club. They have events in which, in the major cities, New York, San Francisco, other places around the country, And they have offices or branches in Switzerland, in the UK, perhaps in other countries as well. And if you're a member of the club and you have these events and you produce your money, just as other Jewish organizations do, and that's how you become a member. It's a form of very visible virtue signaling. And from this, they funded many of these organizations. I've had some interesting discussions with, for instance, the former president of NIF, who is certainly a progressive, but a strong Zionist. And he was troubled. I'm going back, but his name was I remember Brian, I'll remember his name in a minute. But he was the Lurie, and he was the president. They have an Israeli and an American that take turns. Naomi Chazan was at one point in one of those positions. Talia Sasson was. He was the American, head of the American branch. And he was very troubled by a number of the organizations that they were funding because of the virulent anti-Zionism. These were no longer, just like we talked about earlier, the Human Rights Watch and others, they were all part of that network. And their agenda went from we promote human rights to Israel is a country of war criminals. You had Chagai Alat from B'Tselem, who was one of he was a fig leaf for saying Israel's an apartheid country. If Chagai Alat from B'Tselem says it, then it's okay for Amnesty and Human Rights and so on, the other groups to say that. And these were all funded by New Israel Fund. They provided the core funding. What's really also interesting and very clever is that over the years, they were able to get the majority of the funding transferred to European governments. So that would allow the New Israel Fund to create new organizations by stirring up the pot. So you have, originally it was B'Tselem, and then it became Breaking the Silence, and then they shifted the players on the board a little bit, and then you have Yesh Din, Hamoked, and you see that
these organizations are very radical. They support, how should I call it, the de-Judaization of Israel. They are anti-Zionist. Some of them supporting the right of return, which means making Israel a Muslim majority country and making Jews a minority in it. So
I want to be careful because each organization and the individuals have their own political philosophy, some more radical, some less radical in that position. So I would not say they're all in that category.
Not all, but certainly, look, the New Israel Fund, correct me if I'm wrong, also gave money to Adallah.
Yes.
Adallah promote the right of return openly.
Adallah and another organization called Musawa, there are 4 or 5 different Israeli Arab organizations that are part of the NIF branch. And part of my conversation with Brian Lurie and others was, well, we have to have Palestinian Israeli partners to speak to. We don't have to agree with their agendas. And of course, my response was, why are you giving them money? You can speak to them without giving them money. Well, they won't speak to us then. And then at one point they would say to me, well, if we don't give them money, Kuwait will give them the money. And I think he meant Qatar in those days, but anyway, Qatar would give them the money. And the agenda wouldn't change. But it makes a big difference if an organization is sponsored by the New Israel Fund, which calls itself Zionist, and in which there are real Zionists still.
But there, I had an exchange in the press while I was still writing for Haaretz with David Myers, who's the president, and Professor David Myers. And all his formulations were slippery. They were like, what do you mean? We're not anti. I don't remember. He said he's not an anti-Zionist. He said we support the right of everyone to self-determination, all citizens of Israel, things like that, which sound like they mean that they support the national liberation movement of the Jews, but actually mean that all citizens have an equal right to self-determination in Israel, which means it can't be a nation state.
Gadi, I think there is also, I think the book has to be written, and I have a pile of documents, but who knows when I'm going to get time to do that, on the history of the New Israel Fund, because I think they were definitely Zionists. They were Shimon Peres type Zionists in the late 70s and 80s. And this radicalization and the accumulation of the language of not just progressivism or wokeism in the United States, but intersectionality infected this. And I think David Myers is a classic case. He's not Brian Lurie. who I think is clearly was and remains a Zionist and is disturbed by some of these statements, not disturbed enough to say I resign in protest. I also see this, by the way, when I speak to some of the donors. I've had some conversations with donors. Some of them, a few of them have left, but some of them also will say that we have to take the Adalahs and the breaking the silences because they help women, battered women, and Ethiopians, and they deal with all these other societal issues. And that is a serious point, that they use those other issues to convince their donors to maintain their funding.
Actually, Gerald, I don't completely buy this intersectional argument, because often they support organizations that promote, how should I say, traditional Arab values, which don't always fit with the LGBT and women's rights agenda. So this creates this confusion, which you can only have in an American university, where a bunch of queers would hold a sign saying "Queers for Palestine," while we all laugh, because if you make 5 steps into the Palestinian Authority and declare you are gay, you will never come back. So this too, that, you know, let's promote these Islamist radicals because it promotes the rights of Bedouin women or something. Well, it doesn't.
I'm not going to disagree with you, but to have that discussion with David, you can't have that discussion with David Myers. He'll dismiss it. Well, that he might say that's a small price to pay, or he just may ignore the point completely. And that's a serious issue, because at a budget of 30 million, I come back to the money, $30 million a year. At one point, they actually got money from the European Union. But when we exposed that, then the money stopped, because it's supposed to be a grassroots Jewish supported organization around the world.
So it's mostly American Jews.
Mostly American Jews, but also Swiss and also British in minor ways. Mm-hmm. Some of those have a lot of money. That argument that we are the progressive voice of Israel, and we need to fight the radical right and the Smotriches and the Ben-Gvirs, that sells well to their donors. And that's also part of the political gamesmanship that they play. So I think that this is not an issue that's going to go away. It has many different layers. I also don't see that they're going to, after October 7th, after Hamas, that they're going to say, wait a minute, this is going too far. And that's also a problem that needs to be addressed.
Well, hopefully some of that money would be freed from avenues that cause Israel damage into avenues that fight anti-Semitism, because what happened is not just that the Israeli left received a massive shock. They're all over Israel's social media. People say, I've woken up, I've changed my mind, I supported peace, but these people just want to kill me. But also Jews, who many of whom are philanthropists and contributed to universities, then to discover that their sons and daughters are being hounded for being Jewish by Palestinian organizations. So do you see that money being diverted to actual care of human rights, such as let's prevent some anti-Semitism on our campuses?
I'm too much of a, I would say, realist or pessimist to be able to predict something like that. I would hope that would be the case, and it may turn out. You're right. There's some very important people who pulled their money, people with a lot of money, who pulled their money from Harvard and Columbia, from people like Bill Ackman and Seleka and others who pulled the money out from major universities on that issue. Perhaps this part of American Jewish society will become more careful about the way in which they provide their money. And dealing with anti-Semitism, also on the left, which is obviously very pervasive, may become an issue that they will understand and contribute to. It hasn't changed in the last 20 years, but perhaps, or even 30 years, but perhaps there's an opening.
Professor Gerald Steinberg, president and founder of NGO Monitor, thanks for making the time for this conversation.
Gadi, thank you very much.